It's wonderful to be here. I've done a lot of M&E work, and in fact my PhD was in monitoring, not in evaluation, and for me that's a big difference because evaluation is kind of they're often very snapshot perspectives, whereas monitoring is a much more continuous process of learning and data collection and sense making, which is really essential if we're looking at systems dynamics and feedback loops. And so I really wanted to emphasize that. But what I wanted, well, when I joined Oxfam, I became a head of research, and there's a different department in Oxfam, which is evaluation and impacts and MEL. And so I would sometimes look longingly at the other side of literally of the building, but I found ways to collaborate. But I've really enjoyed being in research because it has allowed me to let go of the constraints of the profession. And I'll come back to that in a minute. So my talk is really a bit of an invitation to stretch your thinking about what M&E should and could and does involve, and how to approach it differently and what we might not be seeing. So that's what I will speak about. I'll give a very brief introduction to how I see M&E, and then I'll talk about our Zero Hunger, Zero Emissions project or initiative, it's not really a project, in Bangladesh, and then kind of tie it back into M&E. So M&E, for me, this is a bit of a caricature, but this is how I experience it and what we are taught to do well. And I do say we. We are taught to be very backward looking. So we look in the rear mirror of what has happened and retrospectively make sense of our path and the journey, right? So it's always looking at the past. How well we have done. It's also an exercise in bounding. So when you're an M&E person, you have to decide what's in your scrutiny and what's outside your scrutiny. From a systems perspective, it's often very, very bounded. And then one of the big challenges early on in an evaluation process is to identify those boundaries, right, that you're going to be looking at. And it's blinkered. Blinkered is not a very nice word to use, I guess, but it sounded nice, BBB, right? So I'm using that, but we're taught to focus, and that's what we bring to it, right? We're taught to not look too much to the side, because we're asked to look at the project or the program, which is often the contractual agreement. Sometimes there is policy evaluation. How many of you here are doing policy evaluation, by the way? Oh, actually quite a few, which is great. So sometimes you're asked to do policy evaluation, but oftentimes it's a time-bound piece of work. Even policies are often very time-bound, of course, and that's all you look at. And so what happens then is you come to a snapshot, an evaluative judgment of whether something is good, good enough, not so good, terrible, and hopefully you try to understand why. We don't always get to the bottom of it, but that's part of the task, is to really get to the why. So when we get asked to look at poverty measurements, for example, and if poverty has increased, often that's what's looked at. How many people are better off? But do we ask if it's a sustained escape from poverty? What is the trajectory after that snapshot? When we look, for example, at rice production and whether there's enough to feed a country, which is the case in Bangladesh at the moment when it comes to rice, do we talk about whether the production level can be sustained? And so I think the evaluative judgment can play tricks with ourselves that things are better or worse than they actually are if they're not nested in a systems perspective. So, and this is my moment of Brexit indulgence in a moment. So what happens when the nice, comfortable policy or project that you're looking at is subject to all kinds of unpredictable forces? We have here a political system that was very backward looking, that didn't take into consideration what might happen if. And in the bottom right hand side is a fantastic initiative. My family and I, we were at the Brexit March a week and a half ago, and more than 1 million people turned up. And there's an organization, or kind of as a citizen initiative, called Led by Donkeys, which is fantastic. And what they have done is they have looked at all the statements made in 2015, 2016, 2017 by all the people who are currently in power, like Michael Gove and Jacob Rees-Mogg and all these non-leaders and said, okay, well, you know, this is what they held us, this is what we were asked to judge. We were asked to evaluate the Brexit proposal to say whether we were in or out. So this is Michael Gove. The day after we vote to leave, we hold all the cards and we can choose the path we want. Now clearly, they didn't look at all the possible scenarios that might unfold. I don't think they saw this week coming. And it's just, it's unbelievable actually what's going on there. I talked to a lot of political advisors in Oxfam and they just don't understand. The whole country has stagnated when it comes to policy. I mean, you can't introduce anything until the logjam is cleared. Anyway, led by donkeys. And basically, they didn't look at the assumptions they were making about the future. So I want to transition now to Bangladesh. So Bangladesh has been super focused on achieving the end of hunger, SDG 2, right? But it really isn't paying attention to whether this can be sustained or be combined with global house gas emission policy objectives that it signed up to. And Bangladesh is a fantastic example because it's one of the few countries that are super committed to the SDGs, all of them. Last week, I was talking with the SDG coordinator for Bangladesh, who sits in the Prime Minister's office, Mr. Azad, and he has to look at all the data coming in and has to say, are we making progress or not? And he's talking directly to the Prime Minister. They take it super seriously, but they take it seriously one by one, and that's part of the problem. So, on to food systems. I'm sure you recognize this diagram as one of the many 25 you were referring to, Ruurt. So the food systems nexus is an area where lots of SDGs connect. And the SDGs are way out, well, actually not that way out there, 10 years, 11 years. And there's many, many pathways to get there. So each of them creating winners and losers along the way. And how much time do we spend actually mapping out the possible pathways to say, well, how does our little project or our program or our little policy initiative fit into that imagining of the alternative futures? We don't have a lot of tools to do that very well, but scenario thinking is one of them, and I'll come back to that. How many of you have done scenario thinking work? 2. Great. But food systems, as I think was incredibly clearly explained by Ruurt, is an area where a lot of the SDGs converge. You can't just tackle it in terms of ending hunger. You've got to tackle it in terms of gender inequality, affordable and clean energy, and climate action. And that's what we were really looking at. So what's happened is that the food and climate communities are not looking at this in an integrated way. So agricultural emissions have been excluded from the UN FCC negotiations. And in Bangladesh, agriculture is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases. But the proposed NDCs, which are the nationally determined contributions to greenhouse gas emission reduction in the Paris Agreement, doesn't mention it at all. So how can you sign up as a country? And this is no criticism of Bangladesh, it's just a criticism of how siloed we are in all our thinking. And I think Bangladesh is actually leading on trying to at least take this stuff seriously. So how can we take them together? Because we're never going to be able to achieve one without the other as an integrated set of issues. So for Bangladesh, SDG 2 is very, very high in their priority list. It's been one of them since their independence in 1971. Who from Bangladesh is here, by the way? Okay, well, please correct me if I'm wrong on something. Food security issues have been very, very high on the agenda, and there's a lot of pride to be had in what they've achieved, given incredible, climate change dramas, population growth, and there's been a lot of the sea level rise, but also soil and water salinity, enormous pollution of rivers. So it's despite all of those problems, they've really managed to, at least at a rice calorie level, manage to end hunger now, right? And that's the big issue. There's been some phenomenal amount of work in Bangladesh to be forward-looking. I'll refer to something called Vision 2041, which is like, why 2041? But it's basically they're looking at a next long-term plan, and they think it's going to be finished by 2021. It's a 28-year vision of where it could go. And the Netherlands is very forward-looking, apparently. We have these 100-year kind of visions. I don't know much about the Netherlands, even though I'm Dutch. But Bangladesh is one of the few other countries that also has a very long planning horizon for its delta works, for example. So, so there's a vision for change there. But there's lots of ways to get there. And really, how do we make informed choices about trade-offs? So Ruud was talking about bargaining and negotiating and looking at trade-offs. And this project is really an example of how to start a conversation. You can have all the data in the world. If it's not being discussed and digested and connected, it's going to do nothing for you. So the question for Bangladesh really is, oh, sorry, I don't like animation, but if the current food system continues with business as usual in all the other ways that the economy is organized, can it still maintain high levels of food security going forward? And if we think ahead 30 to 50 years, what will be the challenges there then that we need to plan for now? So it's really inviting the future to sit at the table and to do that in a pondered way, so that you're not going to end up with Theresa May heading over the Niagara Falls equivalent of food insecurity. So there's a lot of, in general terms, there's a lot of changes that are known. Population increases, huge urbanization. Last week I was talking with a lot of researchers from Bangladesh on water pollution, absolutely massive. So given all of that, you can't ignore it. So what are the pathways for Bangladesh? So here's the data now, well, kind of now. 2016 data is always a little bit out of sync with today. But it shows that agriculture-related emissions are massive. Agriculture is 39% of national emissions, and then you still have land use change on top of that, 17%, and it's growing. So 40% of greenhouse gas emissions are from agriculture. So how do you factor that into your food security vision and into your energy vision? Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is scenario planning. And scenario planning seems very far removed from M&E, so just indulge me here, right? So M&E is looking back, but this is where you're actually looking forward. So where does it sit in terms of, if you look at complexity and uncertainty, and Ruud really sketched that dilemma, that problem, that there's enormous uncertainty and enormous complexity when it comes to food systems. You've got facts where you've got low levels of both. You've got some predictions. Predictions are where you really feel that that it's going to be in the realm of reasonable likelihood. And then you get into the kind of projection space, as you think this might happen if. And you're exploring the scenarios going forward. So scenario sits in that stretch space where you're using data from today, but you're allowing yourself to say, what might it start to look like? And in a way, the fan also gives you a sense that there's a whole set of pathways possible. You don't know which one is going to happen, of course. And beyond that, it's pure speculation. So scenarios are plausible descriptions of how the future might develop. They're not kind of like utopia or, Mad Max kind of types of visions. It's really plausible based on an understanding today of how the system is driven and the assumptions you're making. And the idea is that you're exploring the future today in order to make choices. So we basically, the zero hunger, well, I'll come to that in a minute, but if you take it to Bangladesh, when we started this initiative, and I'll describe it in a bit more detail in a minute, one of the first things we did was map out all the different departments and players that would be involved in Bangladesh. And there's like, I don't know, almost 16 or 17 actual ministries and then departments under that. Even energy has got, industry, and then you've got rural energy, but you've got, Ministry of Industrialization, and they all have very different visions for energy. Some just assume it will be there. Others say, no, we're signed up to 1.5, or others say, no, we've actually signed up to 0. So even within just the climate equation, you have a lot of policy incompatibility that is sending signals and making resource allocations and is nudging the system in all kinds of seemingly contradictory directions. Food as well, you're investing heavily in calories, but are you investing in inclusive, what was it? Inclusive, affordable, sustainable, healthy diets. Yep. So how do you then have a conversation at a national level where you pull this information together and start to imagine that possible future? So it really is about starting the conversation, because you have to make people care about the data. You have to make them curious, and you have to make them ready to see that there are trade-offs. So that's really what the project was all about. We did it with the University of Oxford, the Environmental Change Institute, that brought their scenario methodology and did a lot of policy analysis with us. ICAD is the International Centre for Climate Change and Adaptation and Development, led by Salim al-Haq. And I don't know how many of you know Salim al-Haq. He's amazing. He is below the Pope only on the most recent list of 20 most influential climate thinkers and activists. It's amazing. Absolute phenomenon. And each of us brought different things to the table. So in terms of relationships, we all said we have to start this conversation together. Oxfam Bangladesh has a lot of access to kind of people's lives, obviously, and very rooted in innovating with change making. And so we got a grant. It was a research grant for about 18 months. You know, in reality, you have about 14 months left by the time you get the contract signed with the British research system. And we really wanted to identify what are the possible pathways for Bangladesh that consider a zero hunger goal and a zero emissions goal. And also to try and start to initiate a conversation nationally that brought those two together. So very kind of like pretty ambitious for a small piece of research. Because up to that point, all of the SDG policy formulation was siloed and very high level. There's high level people can be very smart, but they're not always connected with the realities of people, and we'll show that in a minute. So this was the aim of the game, and this is how we were developing scenarios, and I'll illustrate this in a lot of detail, but I just wanted to give you the basic steps. So the first was to identify the key challenge, and there we already hit a problem, because people are not ready to talk about zero emissions in Bangladesh. They can't. They can't afford to, almost. You know, they still need energy. They don't have the transition into renewables yet in order to be able to fund the level of economic growth that the country needs. So we had to completely reframe. It's now a zero low carbon futures, because low carbon is kind of nicely, it's comfortable. People are, it's hard to be against a low carbon future, but it doesn't commit you to anything. So it was about reframing the conversation in terms that would be accessible and palatable to the different policy folk. And we did a lot of work with a very wide group of people, saying what were some of the historical concerns and some of the key trends coming out of this. And we particularly targeted the food sector people, because they had to start to see the implications of climate change and their contribution to emissions as part of their thought process. And our first workshop was very interesting. It was very, they were very, we had a lot of academics there as well from universities in Bangladesh, and they were very, very clear that zero emissions was not an option and not possible, not fair, not desirable. So it was a very interesting framing discussion. After that, we had a, you have to identify the building blocks of the scenarios by looking at what are the factors and drivers that influence the food system. In that sense, building on Ruurt's work, we really did look at, okay, and then we had people from retail, from processing, from NGOs working on agroecological alternatives, from fertilizer companies. We had them in the room, and they said, what forces are you experiencing in your work in food systems that are shaping the decisions you make or not? And we had a sea of Post-its. And we started to zoom in, and we said, well, which ones are the most important and the most uncertain? Because that's what this form of scenario thinking focuses on. It says, okay, all the ones that you know and you can cope with, fine, but let's focus on your scenarios. The kind of plausible pathways are most benefited by looking at the stuff that you are least clear about, but have most weight in the scale. And so we decided on 4 possible futures, and I'll show you them in a minute, and what are the main features of them, and we developed them. We went through a process of workshopping at various levels, and I'll describe that as well, to look at finally what are the implications of these scenarios for decisions today when it comes to food production and when it comes to climate change as an integrated ambition. So this form of scenario work basically says once you have your 2 most influential and uncertain drivers, you can start to develop a 2x2 matrix, right? So they said absolutely the most critical and the most uncertain is governance. Who makes the decisions that we are then subjected to or we try to influence when it comes to food and climate? So governance became one axis, top-down authoritarian, which is a tendency, but also kind of attempts to be more decentralized, participatory, and transparent. So there's a spectrum there. The other axis was environmental management. They said environmental management is so key in terms of how we are deciding whether to invest in, high output, high polluting agriculture or agroecology that might not produce enough, who's in charge of the waterways, complete, really a minefield of lack of responsibilities and yet so critical. So proactive environmental management or reactive. Do you want to clean up everything or do you want to actually avoid the problem? So what you then do is you say, okay, if you take the top left, that's where you have decentralized governance and proactive environmental management. That's one pathway. Down the bottom, where you have top-down authoritarian governance and reactive environmental management is is another one, and then you have the other 2 in there. So basically, the content of these scenarios were developed by a lot of discussion with people, just imagining 20, 40, 30 years from now, if this is a reality, what would it look like? So I'll give you a couple of examples of what they're actually written up in the Dhaka Tribune. So there's a web link there for you later. So the green road is the top left. And remember, the trick is that these have to be plausible. This is not just like wishful thinking. It's not like the Christmas tree of Walhalla that you put in that into that scenario. And we had a moment, for example, with Rocky Road where we were like, no, this is never going to happen. This is like dystopia. It's not going to happen. So we then have to make them all plausible within our understanding of what's happening today. I won't read through all of this. I'll just highlight a few points. So the green road is really, actually the starting point is where Bangladesh is today. You use the SDGs to guide policy goals. And there's a few priorities there. Emphasizes reduction of methane emissions, emphasizes more nutritious diets. However, you have a huge legacy you're still dealing with of environmental degradation, and it's very slow and complex. So maybe decisions are made slower than actually the environment and people's lives need. So that's how, there's actually, they're more detailed. Actually, these, I'm just highlighting a few points for the slides. By contrast, the divided road is one of the, I think it was the bottom left, if I remember well. It's where you are moving towards more authoritarian state, so you're going down that spectrum of governance, right? And that's definitely, there was a big crackdown last year with a lot of student protests that, who knows what will happen. You accept a certain amount of inequality, and the emphasis really in that context, because of the authoritarian state and political capture, is that large agribusinesses thrive with a focus on export. And so you have already some really huge dynamics that are then, people are imagining how they will then play out when it comes to nutrition and obesity. And also the power sector is unregulated, or actually regulated by people who are politically captured by the regulation system, and so you have you don't have any solace there in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. The rocky road is where you're at the bottom right-hand side, where governance is weak, erratic. You have a lot of migration to cities and abroad accelerating. Food security is very patchy. So this doesn't sound like a plausible scenario, but this is where the trick comes. So what we then did is we said, fine, if this is how the sector, the food system sector, and there were some climate and energy people in the room as well, if they see that these are 4 possible, plausible pathways for Bangladesh, what do other people think? So we first took it down. We said, okay, let's take it to rural communities. So we went to communities where Oxfam has a presence, and had quite a wide selection of professions involved in the discussions, male, female, age balance, and said, how credible are these scenarios, and what would your life look like if these happened? So we took them through each of those scenarios. I wasn't there, my colleague was, and they said, well, they said things like, to be honest, the rocky road and the divided road is really our lives now already. It's not that implausible. A lot of these issues are already happening, and so they're very real. And they're not just some abstract future out there. But they were actually quite hopeful, which was interesting. They said, but actually, for example, women are getting very digitally connected. The government invested a lot of money, apparently, in these digital hubs so that people could go there and access web-based information. But everyone's got a mobile phone now, so they're kind of obsolete. And these women farmers, because of the migration, this is one area where Oxfam is working. It's not like a pattern for the whole country, are just phoning up, asking what's the rainfall, what's the market price, and they're really starting to be very active agents using the data in their production role. So that was really important to ground tooth it and to understand where they were most fearful. Yes, so they were also a bit skeptical about the green road. So the green road would be the poster child of government, saying, oh, this is where we're headed, right? It's the bliss of SDGs. But they were a bit skeptical from their experience that it would be possible to reduce inputs of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, given the drive to produce more shrimp and to produce more crops in general. And this comes back to the drivers and incentives and consumer behavior and the rewards of the market system. And they also said, well, agroecology is wonderful, but it requires land to experiment, and in fact, we don't actually have that much access to productive land. So how's that going to happen suddenly, right? You've got to make it possible. So then we went up the system. So we had to make this policy relevant. Okay, so this is from the sector. We went down to say, well, how would you live this scenario? We said, how can this start to trigger people who are in policy positions to imagine what decisions they might be able to make today? So we had workshops with senior planning managers in the planning office of Bangladesh, and we asked them things like, will Bangladesh be able to achieve food security and low carbon development in your scenario? We split them into different scenario groups, and they talked about that. They said, well, what are the trade-offs between the two and why? And we introduced inequality. You want an inclusive system. And then what strategies might that mean are needed for food security and for climate change? So is, in fact, a food secure Bangladesh possible in a low carbon future? Okay? It's almost like you're holding up the mirror to them of their hope, their policy hope. So this was the high-level panel that we then were also able to convene, and we asked them this question. What did you do back in 2018, this was at the end of last year, that made the country like it is today? And we asked them to imagine the world in 2041. And we took these scenarios, and they said things like, well, the middle road, that was the one I didn't show. A lot of it's been achieved already. We're actually progressing with aspects of the green road already. But they were very concerned about the digital technology and the divide that this could lead to in the country. And they were also very worried about the emphasis of and the possibility of intensive agriculture and further pollution to the system and food contamination. And the rocky road was the one that excited most interest because they still felt there were elements there that were really possible. And it made them, for example, if we lose sight of the Sustainable Development Goals or climate change accelerated, well, that's a fact, right? If there was poor governance, that's very likely at some level there. If remittances from people working abroad are slashed or national unemployment rates are increased, then all these dynamics play out in the way the food system is able to provide for its citizens. So this led them to really starting to have a discussion about, well, we might need to think differently about policy choices as an integrated set. We also ran workshops with university students. 600 students applied to work with us around these scenarios. We had space for 25. It was a very small project, but it meant they were super, super interested. And these are the leaders of the future. And they were far more pessimistic than the people living in the rural areas. And they said that, and this is, look at this, the second point I think is really interesting because it ties in with what Ruurt was saying. They said actually where our country goes in terms of education and technology is going to be far more important than, in fact, even governance and environmental management, because that was shaping the behavior patterns of consumption around food and climate and energy. But anyway, it was very interesting that they were really, really down about their future. So what did this lead to so far? It was only a one-year effort, but it started to reframe the debate as an and debate rather than a kind of a silo debate. MOUs, they're just pieces of paper, but it's formalizing dialogue that needs to happen between ICAD and the National Planning Office, which it didn't have before. So climate change can be at the table of all these other policy objectives, but also between Oxfam Bangladesh and ICAD, because ICAD wasn't rooted in people. It was rooted very much in the policy sector and the policy debates and the data on, but not the experiences of. And I just wanted to point out the bottom one. Oxfam Bangladesh itself is saying, we've been working on youth employment. But if we think about this ambition of a low carbon future and a food secure future, are we working with them on employment futures that make that possible? Or are we simply reinforcing problematic aspects of society by just saying, become a shrimp farmer? Oops, shrimp farming might not be the best thing. Or become a brick maker. Oops, bricks might not be the best thing, if we need a lot of charcoal to burn them. So starting to have very different discussions about what they are seeding now based on that future vision. Okay, so what does any of this have to do with M&E? And I'll be rounding off. M&E is often focused, on figuring out better, looking backward, etc. So you might feel very proud or happy with how you collect data better or how you framed it better. But there's a few problems that I hope this story has illustrated. First, how are you connecting? Let's imagine that you're being asked to evaluate a Market for the Poor initiative around shrimp farming in the coastal areas of Bangladesh. Completely plausible. What do you know about the drivers? So imagine that you're focusing on food and nutrition security or maybe economic and social well-being, the outcome side of things. To what extent in your evaluative thinking are you going back in the system and saying, are we really understanding what is affecting the good or not so good outcomes in order to be able to feel confident that our assessment is positive or negative on this particular initiative? Yeah, so how big are you stretching your imagination to say that it's to allow yourself to be influenced by these other information elements, by these other aspects of the food system, not just your little initiative, right? So I think there's an invitation to put the boundary somewhere else. The second one is what my husband, Jim Woodhill, calls steam trains and black swans. So evaluation is very good at the known knowns. It's the steam trains of data. In a way, it's a little bit what Ruurt was referring to as static, right? You need to know that we need that data, right? So you're collecting that data. But to what extent do we invest in positive deviance, in the unexpected, in the little meteors that might hit our little initiative, coming back to the systems diagram? Positive deviance, how many, did you deal with that in the course? We had a beautiful example this morning. You were a positive deviant this morning in the exercise that Ruurt, you were the one person who had an inclusive, sustainable, affordable, you cheated there, healthy breakfast. So what is possible, what are the choices that person is making that perhaps we could all learn from, right? So the positive deviance, how much of our time in evaluations is spent or monitoring, looking at these positive deviants and understanding what has made those possible and how they relate back to the funded activity. The third thing is that is about an integrated information system, I guess, including response evaluation. And that ties into an aspect that Ruud mentioned as well, is you need to understand behaviors. So if you are evaluating markets for the poor and you're saying, okay, well, district councils now have I don't know, something that is, some regulation that is talking about the maximum number of shrimp that can be farmed from any given pond. I mean, you've got to then go out and dig deeper and say, well, how many actually have that? How many are implementing? This is the response evaluation. How is society responding to what's needed to change? Or if Unilever says it's dropped salt in its key products, how much has it dropped by? Is it expanding to the entire system of salt in food that it needs to and has influence over? So here are just two examples of integrated food systems, but I won't, integrated information systems. I'll focus on the one on the left because I would love to see a food equivalent of this. So who of you have heard of the donut? Okay, great. So Kate Rayworth, who used to work at Oxfam and developed the donut idea there, she has done a stellar job at trying to get people to look at the world as an integrated set of decisions that are bounded by the natural limitations of biophysical laws, so to speak, and are expanded as much as possible by our agreement around human rights and basic needs and for all. So it's in this little donut that we can live. And it's a beautiful concept. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to develop something like that for food systems? You know, she just has food there as one blob, but you could take some of the fancy diagrams that Ruud showed and say, well, let's unpack that and let's put all those different dimensions there, but also how it then impacts on the environment and what's our space and how much are we out of it and how much are we not reaching it. So I think I would love to see that work being done, but it's not being done. People are making decisions based on very limited aspects of the information. So then these are, I have two more slides. So if we're the green dot, and in our evaluation practice we look at the past, but I never used to, I will now, look at the assumptions when usually you make recommendations, right? You say, oh, this is good, this is bad, I should do more of, less of, certainly with policy evaluation. But what are you assuming about the pathway into the future that is getting you, that is, on what basis are you making that? And Patton said that beautifully when he was here. He said he stopped doing recommendations because he says, I don't know what the future is going to hold. But I'm going to say, so he does the scenario. He says, under this scenario, this would be great. If under this scenario, if this happens, stop doing it. Do something completely different. So can we bring that practice into our evaluative thinking and be less categorical about this evaluative judgment of good and bad and stop or continue, and allow that uncertainty to be there and invite people to look at it. And then finally, a slide. Just as Ruud has a passion for experiments, and your last word was experiment, so I'm going to try and construct a sentence to have my preferred last word. We don't invest anywhere near enough in sense making. So this story of this conversation that we've just started in Bangladesh is really a sense making exercise. It's taking there's modeling happening now by the CGR on the actual data under these different scenarios. You've got to have the right people in the room to give meaning, because it's the people in the room who have to make the decisions. With the crates or with the diet diversity or with the income or with the digital phones, they have to be the ones who live, who feel the reality of what this information means for them. And therefore, I think that the evaluation profession, M&E profession, really needs to get its act together and start to think much more seriously in terms of competence, time, and money on sense making.
Thank you. My name is Petra Berghout. I work at Wageningen economic research. I was very inspired by your talk. Thank you very much.
Hey, two chief inspirators here.
True. I already tweeted that the lecture by Ruud was very inspirational as well. I was just wondering, you said that evaluation is a snapshot, which I agree to, and that you could combine it with scenario thinking, because then it allows you to think about your recommendations and if you have the right recommendations on the different scenarios. But scenarios are not static either. Scenarios change because circumstances change in whatever scenario you have. And I'm used to looking at no regret options, so I was expecting you to say something about no regret options that would be, useful in any type of scenario to implement. Would you agree to that would be a useful step as well, or do you think it should be just, like the way you described it, just looking at the scenarios and then testing your recommendations? I'm not sure if I'm making myself clear.
Yes, very clear, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, anybody else?
Once again, thank you also for the inspiring presentation. Now, you talked about advancing policy debate and expanding food system. And in terms of imagining alternative future, because one of the problems or challenges we're facing is the power holders, those who can make policies, to provide enabling environment, don't seem to appreciate, the challenge that we have. And then the issue of availability of data, interpretation of the data, and perhaps recommendations that would inform, or provide the basis for informed decision making. You find that policymakers out there don't seem to appreciate the enormity of the problem. So perhaps I don't know how we can really deal with this challenge of, responding to the need to advance policy debate, to get the policymakers, perhaps the executive power holders and the legislature to appreciate this issue and begin to formulate, responsible policies that would begin to provide the scenario to begin to think creatively, looking at the future and preparing for the future in order to address these challenges.
My name is Inge Brouwer from Wageningen University, and thanks a lot for your wonderful presentation. I was actually triggered by one sentence in one of your slides, is that you say you collaborate with the CGR modeling group. Now I know this group is really quantitative, so they need data. In my work with CGR, I see a big divide between more the social science approach of scenario analysis, etc., and then the more quantitative approach. So could you maybe share some experiences you have in combining, the quantitative and qualitative results of this scenario analysis?
My name is Gerrit Borman. I'm an advisor at the Wageningen Centre for Innovation. I really appreciate the notion of scenario thinking. I think it's something I'd like to also try and practice. I noticed in the example of Bangladesh, you chose 2 axes for your scenario thinking. My question is, and I don't know if you have an easy, straightforward answer for this, is what variables do you apply in scenario thinking? There could be hundreds.
Okay. No regret options. We didn't look at that, and I think it definitely can come into play. But I would imagine that there's also trade-offs there, so I don't know if it would be helped. I think you just have you still have to go through, you would have no regrets when it comes to inequality, you would have no regrets when it comes to inclusiveness, you would have no regrets when it comes to energy policy, and you'd still have to figure out, you'd still have to bargain and negotiate, right? So I think it takes on an urgency, which I like. We didn't use it in this particular discussion because a lot of I don't know why not. I'll ask Monica, who led the work, why she didn't include that. I'm not sure that I think that you should use evaluation and scenario work, because this is a lot of work. It's not something you just do as a little, 5-day exercise, you tag onto an evaluation process. So, but I do think that I was hoping that some of the 5 reflections at the end can encourage an M&E practice that says, okay, well, I shouldn't assume too much about the future. I should actually draw the net a little bit wider in terms of thinking about systems. I should actually have people in the room thinking about what might happen and what the future of this policy or program or project might be. So it's more the inspiration of a scenarios thinking piece of work that I think is useful. I've not combined it, but maybe other people have.
One should question the ceteris paribus assumption we usually take for granted.
I didn't study Latin.
That's the common phrase used
Oh,
by
I don't know.
economists.
Well, but I didn't
All
study
things being
economics
equal,
either, so
the all things
equally
being-
difficult for me.
All things being equal.
Yeah. Oh, yes. In that sense, yeah. Power holders. I completely agree, which is why I think it's really important to think when you're working on data or evaluation, to think ahead in terms of where are you hoping the behavior change will happen. And I'm going to just draw on some other Oxfam experience now, because I found it very rewarding to do research in Oxfam, because we have such low budgets that what research we do has to have an impact. So before it even gets approved, we look at who are we trying to touch in some way or an influence, and it's pretty granular. It's not like policymakers as a blob. You know, you saw all those post-its. There's lots of people on a map like that. And what do I want the data and the discussion about the data to help them think differently, feel differently, say differently, and do differently? And it's I found it a very simple discipline of my own thinking, because coming back to your notion of how can you move them, right? And Oxfam is actually pretty good, and I don't think it's very effective, to be honest, at scaring people with awful facts. I was like, the world's terrible, right? And I think, well, fine, but it kind of paralyzes you as well. It's that bad, we can't do anything about it. So the flip side, and we are shifting a little bit, and I think you can also see that in some of Oxfam's work, actually quite a lot of it, is being propositional, giving people hope, giving people alternatives. So if you can say, well, you can start to imagine this alternative future. So it comes back to how you think, it's about feeling. What do you want people to feel as a result of the data that you present in front of them? And it comes back to Inge's question, which is the quantitative stuff. Some of that's pretty scary, and they need to see it. They need to see the projections. So the CGI, they are in the middle of modeling. So you take a few of these variables that have come out in the scenarios, such as growth of investment in large-scale agriculture, unabated use of chemical fertilizer, layer it on top of demography, and what is it doing to water systems? What is it doing to nutrition? Well, I don't know if nutrition is in it. It's a very specific set of variables that they're laying onto the scenarios with different kinds of assumptions. And what it shows is that it's not inevitable. Futures are choices. And so, but it also shows that some futures are pretty awful. and so you can trigger people's fear mechanism of saying, ooh, we should probably avoid that. But, I mean, there's only so far you can go with that, because, politicians and policymakers are on election cycles, just like like anywhere else. Oh, the variables, sorry. Mental blank there. We had a very broad discussion about what are all the influences that all these different players are experiencing. And so we had a huge brainstorm with, we're influenced by district legislation. We're influenced by the crappy state of roads. We're influenced by internet unreliability, which means we can't transmit price information or whatever. And then and then we had a very heated discussion. Everyone kind of got stickers, and we all had 10 votes. Everyone had 10 votes. We said, which are the ones that you think are really mainly driving your ability to do your work in the food system, whether they were retailers, processors, chemical fertilizer productions. And so then we were able to zoom in from this gazillion number of post-its on those critical factors. And we had another color for uncertainties. Which are the ones that are most uncertain? that you need to start to imagine. So you take importance, influence, and uncertainty as the two containers around which we then negotiated those crossroads. But there's lots of ways to do scenarios. This is just one. So, I mean, there's manuals and manuals on it.
So let's give Irene a big clap